So here I am just setting up our Blender scene here, and we start off with a plane that's subdivided and then cut, and then we add in some mirror modifiers to it so that all of we're just working basically on that top right hand corner, and everything's being mirrored out across our object. So this is going to be the pillar for our corridor. So now I'm just creating some edge loops there and extruding them inwards to create a recessed area that's going to contain some power banks or resistors or something. And now I'm just editing the basic shape there and adding in some features. So at the top there I'm putting in like an upwards vent, which is going to have a light which will later on cast light upwards towards the ceiling. So that will also then be modeled at the or duplicated at the bottom, so the light will also be cast downwards or upwards there at the bottom towards the floor. So in the side here then, again, I'm just adding in some small panels and features. These are going to just help to catch the light when we light and texture the scene later on. And now I'm on to modeling those power banks. So we start with a cylinder, resize it, and we chop it in half, add a mirror modifier, so everything that I do at the top then would be mirrored at the bottom. We use the spin feature to just bring out the top, and then we've also going to add an array so that they're copied across. So everything that we do on the right hand side of our column will then automatically be mirrored on the left, as you can see there. We create the two resistors on the right side and then mirrored over to the left. So it took me a couple of attempts to make this and get it exactly how I wanted it to look, but eventually we got there. So I've decided just to leave those as just plain basic columns, and then I applied a smooth shader to that so that it would be shaded smooth. Everything else is not going to have a smooth shader to it in the main, because we want to maintain those sharp edges on the corners, but obviously those cylinders want to be rounded. So I'm just adding in some cuts there, which are going to create some recessed areas which will have some lighting inside. So as we look down our corridor, you'll see some lights, and then I'm adding in there a pipe as a feature. Turns out that pipe maybe was a little bit unnecessary. You won't really see it in the final render, so you could probably go without that. It's a bit of a fine balance when you're doing this modeling between getting too many faces and vertices, so it was going to take a long time to render, but also having enough detail for it to look believable. So what I'm creating here is just an array of planes tilted at an angle, which is going to form some kind of vent on the side there. So that'd be some kind of air conditioning or air intake or something. I just went back and I remodeled that top light. I wanted it to point upwards rather than downwards. Then I extruded out the wall, and then we're going to add an array modifier to it and also mirror it in the opposite axis, in the Z, I think. And then we're going to start adding in the floor. So the floor is done in the same way. We bring in a plane, and the plane is then subdivided and mirrored, and then we join it to our wall, and when we join it, it'll automatically then become part of it, and the array modifier will then automatically be applied to it, and it's copied along the whole length. So now we've got our ceiling and our roof, but the ceiling and the roof are not going to be mirrored because we want them to be different. The ceiling is going to have a different feature to the floor, which will be shaped differently. So we don't want an exact mirror modifier on there. So I used proportional editing on the top there to get a slightly curved upper surface. I decided to have it curving inwards, but then I think I changed again and we went back to curving upwards. But then I kept it curving downwards, but I added that channel in the center, and that channel is going to contain a pipe which will be inputted now. So we start with a cylinder, and then that cylinder will be extruded to the correct length, and we join it to our main object, and then it will automatically, again have that array modifier applied to it and copied down the whole length. Then I had two pipes in either side. So we've got two smaller pipes and one larger one. And then I modeled into there a separate piece, which is kind of our pipe holder. And then I've also added in those what maybe air vents, or they could turn out to be lights later on into the ceiling. So those air vents are modeled in the same way as we did the ones in the pillars. And again, as it turned out, by the time this is backlit, they don't really show up in the final render, so it was probably some wasted rendering time on those. So you could probably go without them and just keep it as a light. But I didn't find out till after it was rendered that you couldn't really see them. So again, that's just a plane, and we added an array modifier to it, and then that array has been joined to our main object and duplicated. So I'm adding in a pipe now on the wall. I just wanted to adjust the top part there. And then I add a little bit of features, so that pipe on the wall is going to have some recesses in it, some bulges. It's not going to just be a plain pipe. We just add a bit of interest to it. Now I'm working on the floor, so I've recessed that area because we are going to have some lights underneath the floor. So just recessed that in preparation, and now I'm starting to work on the control panels. So I created a square or cube object, and then I was modeling some features on there, some electrical cables, some connectors and plugs, and some buttons, just to make it kind of look like fuse boxes and electronic components. Because this corridor is supposed to be, I know, maybe the engine room of the spaceship or something. So I just put some switches and dials and whatnot. So it's just pretty basic modeling. We start with basic shapes, then we extrude them out. So there's some resistors modeled in a similar way to how we did those power banks. And I try and reuse as many objects as possible. So you can create one object, and then you can copy it, and you can scale it and spin it around. And really, in the final render, no one will really notice that it's a mirrored or copied object anyway. By the time you change the size and rotation of them. And anyway, we're not really getting close in the final render on these features, so you don't need to add too much detail to them. Just the basic outline of the shape is probably enough, because they're kind of going to be kind of in a dark area anyway. But we need them basic features to be there just to sell the realism of the scene. So this was probably the longest part to model, and I maybe added a little bit too much detail to them, but so that could have increased our render time and our polygon count a little bit. But at the time, I wasn't exactly sure how visible they were going to be in the final render and exactly what my camera angle was going to be, and maybe I wanted to do some multiple renders at different angles, so I figured I may as well add the detail in while I'm here and modeling it. So these are some kind of, I don't know, hard drives or battery packs or something with handles on that can be pulled out. And again, I copied those objects, I resized them, I moved them around so they look kind of different to each other. But they're all basically the same objects that are being copied and resized and reused, and then modified slightly. I'll add a bulge in on one where there wasn't on another, or whatever. So there's our first control panel done and put into place. And then I'm going to work on a second one. And this is going to be like an emergency panel. It's going to have some kind of lever on it and maybe a flashing alarm. So there's our basic box, and there's our lever, maybe an emergency pull handle or something. And we'll texture that red later on. And then on the right hand side, I add a little alarm or siren or flashing light that can also be lit up later. So there's our emergency box, and then I mirrored that and just lined it up, so it's copied a few times down the corridor. But you also need to consider at a certain point you can no longer see the wall because of the perspective and the pillars are in the way, so there's no point in placing the panels in areas where they can't be seen because the computer is going to have to render it anyway. So again, I'm making a kind of fuse box panel. I put some kind of microprocessor or chip on there. And then these are some buttons and some plugs. Some switches. And like another box with some cables attached to it. It could be some kind of power meter or something. Then again, I made some copies of that and added it to our final scene. Now these pipes that I'm adding in, or these tubes, are going to be the beginnings of our floor. So it's just going to be very basic array, and then we rotate the array around and I resize it. There's our grid, makes our floor. And it doesn't go all the way, it goes kind of a little less than half, and then we've got it copied on the other side because I have a raised section in the middle which I'm going to have a light on, so we'll have like a light running down the center of the floor. And then underneath the floor, underneath this grid, we're going to have some lights underneath there which will kind of glow from underneath the floor and add a sci-fi type look or effect to our scene. So there I'm adding in the raised section in the middle. I just have to do half of it because it's mirrored on the other side. I'm adding in another pipe here. This is going to be kind of a rusty one, and we've got a flange on this pipe where the pipe sections are joined together. Then I select the edge loops at the end and I make sure everything is aligned up. That's important. I just hit L, Y, and 0, and that will align everything at the end. Now I'm beginning to work on the rear, so this is going to be our bay door at the end. So you want to have kind of a funky shape in the middle there, which is going to be our door. And I bevel it a little bit. So then I put some panels into that door. And then I will model the locks and kind of an unlocking mechanism, some kind of keypad and screen for unlocking the door. So this is going to be our locks. And then this is our keypad. So again, it's just really very, very basic modeling. It's not difficult to do. Just some cylinders and some cubes. Then we add in a column there. And there is our bay door put into place. I'm just going around and just adding in some final touches, some bevels on some of the columns where I want them, and finishing off the ceiling there with some additional features that I wanted. Just adding in, construction lines or panels or whatever it is that I think necessary that will also help to catch the light and help to sell the scene. So I added in a little panel there on the side. I'm going to put some side lights inside of that panel. And now I am beginning to mark the seams ready for unwrapping. No, I'm marking some of the solid edges and just doing some fine adjustments to the floor. Okay, now we start the UV unwrapping, and it's a matter of selecting objects which are going to be unwrapped, and it can be a little tedious process. We need to add the seams so that it's unwrapping correctly for us. So there's a few places where we have to add seams, which would basically, if you imagine, if you wanted to unfold this into a flat piece of paper, where the cuts would be placed so that you could unfold this. And where those cuts are is basically where our seams will be. And now you can see it's unwrapping a little better. And I've applied a UV grid texture So once we view this UV grid texture in our scene, it will help us to identify areas where the texture maybe is being stretched or is at the wrong rotation or wrong angle. So it helps us with the unwrapping process before we actually go and apply a texture to it, which maybe is a little harder to identify which areas are stretched and rotated. So we check our UV grid there. I just make sure everything's square and aligned up. Once I'm happy with that, I then import my metal texture, which is what is going to be, there you can see, applied to our object. Now I'm just going around adjusting the areas which maybe still needed rotating just to match our texture flow. You can see that this texture has kind of streaks down it like water and rust stains. So you want to make sure that on the walls they all flow in the same direction. You don't want some going horizontal and some going vertical. That would just look strange. So the unwrapping process can sometimes be a little bit tedious, a little bit, requires a little bit of patience, and you also need to identify which parts maybe should not be textured using this, and then we'll have to go in and kind of identify those and texture them with something different. We can also resize the UV unwrap so that sometimes you can scale it so it hangs over the edge. As long as you match your seams up correctly, it will look okay when it's tiled. So now we are working on the pipe. I just took me a few attempts just to get the correct unwrapping for that. And this is going to be a rusty effect. So you can see I've got a different base metal there for the pipe to give it this rusty pipe look. So the flanges were a little bit tricky on that pipe, but I got there in the end. And then this pipe is a pretty basic shape. So that was relatively easy to texture there. And now I'm on the roof pipe, where I'm going to use a different texture. This one's got kind of rivets in it for the two pipes at either side. I tried a couple of different textures, and actually in the final render I just decided to remove the texture completely and just went with a basic shader. But I did keep that kind of rusty pipe in the center, but I used a different rusty texture to the one I used on the wall. So then I came to the floor, and again I applied a texture to it, but later on before the final render I actually removed it and just went with a basic base metal shader that I created within Blender itself. Depending on the level of detail you want to go to, depends on whether you're going to texture everything or not. Because it can be quite time consuming to have to unwrap, especially some of these more complex objects. But if you really want to create a very accurate render, a kind of something which you're going to submit to forums or something, then you want to go and create textures for each of these individual resistors and things like that, and then UV map them. I'll actually do a proper tutorial later on UV mapping and unwrapping those resistors and some awkward shapes like that. For now, this tutorial isn't really step-by-step, in-depth. It's just kind of a quick overview of the workflow of how I put this together. This tutorial, was actually inspired by another tutorial here on YouTube, which covers about 3 hours in total, which really goes through step-by-step on the modeling of this. So now I'm just applying kind of base colors to these objects, making them look resistor-like. And now I just texturing the alarm panel. So you see there I've gone for the riveted type effect. And I created some glow, emission textures also to emit some lights. So all of these are just base colors. As you can see anyway from the perspective view, you're not really getting close into these objects anyway to really see them. So it's not vitally important that you have, very detailed textures on there, and it's going to be in shadow anyway. We just, you just want some color there, just to show that there's something. So now I'm adding in my emitters to begin to light the scene. So I've got some white emitters there, which are going to light different areas. I was just trying to put some lights behind that grid, but then decided not to because you can't really see the grid anyway once those lights are in. So these are the fluorescent tubes or lights which will be underneath the floor. They're just basic cylinders with the end caps removed and the emission texture, the white light applied. So you can see in our kind of render preview there, we're beginning to get a kind of believable scene. I played around using some yellowish colored lights, but I didn't really like it. And anyway, if we do want to have a yellow tinge to it, we can do that in post-production. We can do some coloring and editing of the RGB values to the highlights and the shadows, and then we can create that kind of yellow tinge if we want later on. I've also still got the material applied to the floor at this stage, but later on I removed that. I also made a blue light, which I used in the recessed areas, and now I'm creating a flat circular object, which will be our bright light emitter, which goes above the bay door at the end and just helps to focus the eye at the end of the corridor. Kind of helps to lead our eye through the scene. As a general rule of thumb, your eye is always attracted to the lightest part of a picture. So if you're doing black and white photography or whatever it is, your eye will be drawn towards the light areas. So if you have a light area where you don't really want people to be looking, their eye will be drawn there. And if there's nothing really to look at, then it kind of doesn't look that good. So you want the bright areas or the white areas or the light areas to be the parts where you wish their eye to be drawn to. And the reason this scene works so well is because you've got quite strong parallel lines with the perspective. It helps to lead your eye through the scene. You've got these lights on the floor which are also helping to lead your eye from the front of the picture through to the end of the corridor, and it's almost like we are leading you through this corridor. You want to walk through it. You're almost walking through it with your eye as you look down it. So that's kind of why this perspective in this scene works so well. And by having that bright light at the end, it helps to focus our eye at the end of the corridor and makes kind of the rest of the corridor almost in your peripheral vision. So you're just aware that these pipes are there, you're aware that these features are there. And the funny thing is even though they're not main features of the scene, it's not something that you're drawing the eye's attention to. By paying attention as the artist to those details, it's funny that your eye notices when they're not there, but when they're there, you don't really notice they're there, but there's something just feels realistic about the scene. So now I'm adding in our shaders, which help us to give some glow effect to those lights. You can see there we've got the glow is being added and some light beams kind of coming off them, some glare. And now adding some atmospheric fog to the end of the scene, altering the color of that fog. Now we are playing around with the color balance of our final image to get the kind of bluish, grayish metal look, and there is our final rendered image. So in total it probably took me about 8 hours of modeling, but that's it. There's your finished scene.